Welcome. We are going to get going, and I know that we have some more people who are going to be joining us very soon. Um, so let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm Chris Franks. I'm the Chair of WomenAid and Development. Delighted to be here to welcome everyone. And we're going to start off today with our facilitator, Jill, who is going to introduce our three fabulous speakers. We are really, really very lucky to have them joining us today. Jill is one of our directors, and she's a media and communications consultant in the development sector with great interest in and strength in sport for development advocacy, facilitation and partnerships. She lectures at ACU in international development, and she's been a member of our board for several years, 6, 7 years. She's also a journalist, an Australian volunteer in the Pacific. She's worked for the ABC, and she spent a lot of time in Vanuatu, which is close to her heart. So I'm going to hand over to Jill. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. That's great. Welcome, everybody. Really pleased that people could join us tonight for what we consider a bit of a jewel in the crown for Women in Aid and Development for our events each year. We love kicking off the year with our International Women's Days events. This is a little unusual. We normally do an in-person one for each city, certainly in our capital cities. This year we're doing online. And as Chris said, we've got three fantastic guest speakers tonight. We're very, very proud and honoured to have them with us. So I'll start by a bit of an introduction into what we're doing, what we're celebrating for International Women's Day this year. So balance the scales is one of the key themes for IWD this year. And tonight we're going to be discussing about how we can balance those scales to ensure fair and inclusive and accessible justice for every woman and every girl. The theme brings attention to the urgent need for fairness, for the world to be a fairer, have more inclusive and accessible justice systems for girls and women around, globally. UN Women apparently chose the theme in part because despite decades of progress, there are still so many barriers that block women and girls from accessing justice, and that's something we'll be exploring tonight. So as part of exploring this theme and these ideas, we're joined by, like I say, our three very special guests from three organisations which are working very hard to reduce and eliminate violence and exploitation and to provide women and girls with that important access to justice. So our three guest speakers, we have Noor Aziza, Debbie Stoddard and...
What is it?
Sorry?
Huh? What do you need?
Jules Frost, sorry, I'm hearing things, sorry. So Noor is an award-winning Rohingya human rights advocate, an academic and an educator with over a decade of experience working across refugee-led initiatives, community advocacy and international policy spaces. She's the co-executive director of I apologise for my pronunciation if I get this wrong, Rohingya Maiwhānau Collaborative Network, so RMCN, and I'll get her, like I say, to go into more detail about RMCN during our chat. Her work supports Rohingya women who have survived genocide, trafficking, systemic violence, and more importantly, works to ensure that refugee-led leadership informs the decision-making at all levels, which is something I know we all want to see. And if that doesn't sound busy enough for her, Noor is also an academic at the University of Sydney and teaches English as a second dialect specialist educator. So very, very busy. She's also, both she and her work have been widely recognised with several national awards, including the 2024 New South Wales Young Woman of the Year Award. She's also served as a refugee delegate and expert in various UN processes, which is No mean feat. Debbie Stoddard is the coordinator and founder of ALTSIAN, which is Alternative ASEAN Network, as is my understanding, leading to the establishment of ALTSIAN Burma in 1996. She served as Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights for about 6 years. Debbie, I think, is the current, is the current chair of the International Network for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and also the International Campaign for Rohingya, and the chair of Innovation for Change. An activist from her early teenage years, she's been engaged in innovative capacity building programs, public advocacy, and a range of strategic initiatives around the region, including Australia and parts of Asia, around Thailand and Malaysia, focusing on thematic priorities of business, human rights, atrocity prevention, and women's leadership. And this seems to be a core theme that I'm keen for us to explore. Very focused on training and mentoring young feminists as part of that. And interestingly, we'll see if they actually follow her in her young activist footsteps, as it were. Our final guest, but by no means least, is Jules Frost. So Jules is the CEO of Hagar International, which is a global organisation working to end human trafficking, slavery and abuse. So since stepping into this CEO role, Jules has led Hagar through strategic renewal, with a strong focus on survivor-centred practice, locally led solutions and addressing the structural drivers of the exploitation which impact women and children. And again, I look forward to exploring that a little bit more with her. So she comes with more than 25 years experience across humanitarian, development and human rights contexts, and is a regular speaker on women's leadership, protection and systems change in the aid and development sector. So from all those three bios, I guess, I think everyone can see where there are several common themes that we will really explore tonight and really get some interesting insight on. So welcome, ladies. Thank you very much for joining us here on our special event for Women in Aid and Development. I'm going to start by asking each of you about your journey to reach your current roles, even though, like I say, I've outlined quite a bit of that in my introduction, because we like to give people a bit of an insight or an understanding of the pathway that's brought you to this point, both personally and professionally. Jules, I'll start with you. If you'd like to take the floor and tell us a bit about how you got to where you are in terms of the role you're doing.
Thank you so much, Jill, and for the kind introduction. Also for Women in Aid and Development for convening and inviting me to be part of this. So I started my journey, I wanted to be a National Geographic photographer way back in the day. And I had an opportunity to go to Africa while I was in university to work with orphans in Uganda. And that's where the journey started. And I ended up working for an advertising agency, and my client was World Vision. And I soon then discovered I did not want to write about this, but I wanted to be about doing the work. And I was fortunate enough to have a career with World Vision for over 20 years, predominantly in emergency response. And my last posting there was as the civil military police advisor, which is basically working with state and non-state armed actors where World Vision was present, and how did we engage with them. And that led me to being able to come back to Australia. I'd been here during the Asia tsunami response with World Vision and wanted to get back here. And I was fortunate to have a post with the Australian Civil Military Centre as the humanitarian advisor to the Australian Defence Force, police, and whole of government. And that was through being seconded from ACFID. And when I received permanent residency, I had been already on the board of Hagar Australia. And through that avenue, when the opening came for the international CEO, I was asked if I would consider applying. And so I started this role almost a year ago, in April it'll be, and it's been such a pleasure to be part of the mission and vision that Hagar has of eliminating human trafficking, modern slavery, and abuse. So I'll leave it there. It's just a real pleasure to be here and be able to talk about this theme of balancing the scales. Jill, I think you're muted.
I am sorry, it's a habit. Mute myself just to be polite. Sorry.
Thank you.
Before I move on to Nor next, I just wanted to ask you very quickly about your civil military police advisor beginning with World Vision. Do you look at the current situation, having done that and been in that situation, do you look at the current global situation and the trend both in disaster and conflict zones and worry about what would be seen as maybe the emerging fragility towards the aid sector in those troubled zones? Has it changed that much, do you think, in terms of what we're now seeing and what we're perhaps getting more concerned about?
I don't know that the environments where humanitarian work has changed that much. I think over the last maybe 10 years, the number of non-state armed actors, their lack of acknowledgement of international humanitarian law and principles has increased. That has been a problem historically in certain pockets, but maybe there's more of a trend that we've seen where IHL is not regarded as it should be. And when we see major Western powers violating that, it does not serve the humanitarian community well. I think where we've seen the substantial change in the last few years is the reduction of assistance being funded. And that's from what's happened in the US, cutting USAID. And then the onward implications of that relating to nationalism. And so the lack of resources and reducing the system's ability to respond has increased the complexities just inherent in those actions.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I say, it just occurred to me there was a link there in terms of what we're facing currently, which is just distressing. And it's always interesting. We think that current trends tend to be a new thing, but you wonder historically if it's just a continuation or a repetition of history, really. Thank you for that. So, Noah, over to you. Tell us a bit about how you got to and you've achieved so much in your young years, can I just say? So please tell us a bit about that.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Noor Aziza. I'm a proud Rohingya woman, genocide survivor, and the co-executive director of a refugee-led, women-led, Rohingya-led organization called Rohingya Maya Final Collaborative Network. And Maya Final just means of women in our language. And Debbie Stoddard, which you'll hear from in a little bit, has been a guiding light for my entire team, and she's been a mentor since day one. So I wanted to acknowledge that and make sure that she's shaking her head, but it's the truth. We've learned a lot from her, and she's always ensuring that the Rohingya are not excluded when we are talking about the future of Burma, Myanmar. So before I was doing advocacy or speaking at events like this, I was just a displaced child. One of my strongest memories from childhood was living undocumented in Malaysia after my family fled the genocide in Myanmar. So we were living in an abandoned building. And one particular memory that I remember was when word spread that immigration police were coming that evening to collect undocumented migrants. And people said that police would arrive with lorries. And I remember those lorries. I remember seeing them, and I remember seeing the back of the lorries. I would see entire families, babies, children, mothers, transport all of them away. And I knew in my heart I did not want to be in that lorry. So my mother did everything she can to ensure that we would never end up there. So that specific night, my mother heard the police were nearby. She quickly gathered all of us and told all of us to hide. In this abandoned building in Borneo, Sabah, there was a very small space under the balcony, barely enough any room to crouch down, and our feet could only fit a very tiny corner. So my mother pushed all of us, and she whispered to all of us, "Don't even say a word." I remember her carrying me and said, "Don't even breathe." She put her hand over our mouths, and we stayed there in complete silence, 5 children. And then we heard footsteps. We heard the heavy boots walking through the building, slowly, loudly echoing, "Is anybody in here?" And we could hear the police going door to door. So that building was so quiet, you could hear everything. The sound of their boots hitting the concrete every single step, metal doors opening, children crying. So my mother made sure that we knew what we had to do, and we knew we couldn't say a single word. And I remember trying to breathe as quietly as possible. So all of a sudden, the police walked away, and we survived. We survived that 0.5 seconds of being detained and being in that lorry, just like many children today that are being criminalized for escaping genocide in Malaysia. And in 2003, the Australian government granted my family and I asylum. And that's when I started doing work for the community. And now we started with a team of 4 Rohingya women. We're an international human rights organization. And today we're a team of 16 Rohingya women. We work across the region in places like Malaysia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka. And I can cover more about what we've been doing on the ground to help women, especially invisibilized women that don't get platforms like this to share their stories. There are 3 million Rohingya today, and within the 3 million, only 1% live in freedom. And for me, doing this work is truly just out of love for my people and community, because nobody is speaking about the Rohingya. And I think we need to shift that and change that, because collective amnesia will never end a single genocide.
Thanks for that, Noor. I'm interested. I'm just interested in you. Obviously, those memories for you of your childhood are obviously still very fresh, and are obviously the catalyst for the path you chose. So, given that you went, like you say, straight into helping the community and it's built from there, it can't have been easy in your situation. What sort of hurdles, what sort of obstacles did you come across in trying to pursue that pathway or that journey?
Yeah, I mean, because of the genocide and persecution of Rohingya, we've completely shifted to a patriarchal community and society where men are making decisions for women and speaking on women's behalf, saying, "Oh, I have 3 daughters, so I know what it's like to be a woman. I don't need to hear it from a Rohingya woman." And yeah, it was a very lonely journey at the beginning of my work. I had your annoying uncles from the community that would quietly and sometimes not so quietly say, "Oh, you shouldn't be speaking at this event and flying here and there. You should be finding a husband, giving him children, cooking for him." And I didn't like that. I said, "Piss off, like, I cook for yourself." And so these are some of the hurdles within the community. But then outside of the community, I think it's the lack of support for Rohingya women in place, or overlooking the plight of the Rohingya, seeing it as a domestic issue inside Myanmar. And truly, it's not a domestic issue. We know that states are arming Myanmar military and other ethnic armed groups, and people not giving a single care about Myanmar. And, as everyone on this call knows, that the media is not covering Myanmar. And I think as a team, we've given up on this lack of appetite to cover it. So there are barriers, but I couldn't do this work alone. And we've been so lucky to be supported by Debbie. She came to the first mission a couple of years ago in Indonesia when we visited the Rohingya refugee camp. And some of the stories of the women are so harrowing. For example, 6 Rohingya women last year were escaping the violence in Myanmar, and they were trafficked across the Andaman Sea by an Indonesian human trafficker. All the 6 women were raped by the same human trafficker on the boat. And when they arrived in Aceh, they were all pregnant, and by the same guy, the same loser. And we were the first organization to provide gender sensitive care to these 6 women until today. They've given birth. We visited them last year, and we saw the children. And unfortunately, because of public hate and animosity, we've had to put these women in safe housing, safe shelters, because they're seen as the devil. They're seen as not real Muslims. And this is just a snippet of what Rohingya women have to go through. That violence does not escape when you flee that border across Myanmar. It follows you. It follows you across ASEAN. And ASEAN does not have any protective mechanism or laws in place for Rohingya. And the UN have called the Rohingya the most persecuted people in the entire world today.
Thanks for that, Nora. I was going to say there's another question I'll ask you, but I think I might bring in Debbie here to tell us about herself, because I think the question I want to ask can be addressed to both of you. So Debbie, if you'd like to talk to us. Nora's given us a bit of an impression of how you have obviously been a mentor to her in terms of the work she's doing. You obviously have those common threads working with the Rohingya, especially women and girls. So if you'd like to tell us a bit about your journey and what you've been doing and how you've gotten here.
I think Nur has been very, very generous and kind in her description of me. I am a Malaysian. And when Nur was hiding from the immigration with her family, I was already in Thailand, having set up ASEAN Burma, the Alternative ASEAN Network of Burma. But I don't think anything that I could ever do, that I would do, could ever make up for how fucked up the Malaysian and basically our regional governments have treated refugees, asylum seekers, and survivors of genocide, especially women. So I think this is something we really need to understand, that Nur is one of millions of women and girls that we failed to protect. We failed in terms of a fundamental justice, because for most women and girls, for most people who have fled violence, who have been persecuted, just the fundamental protection, the ability to live without harassment, without fear of detention, arrest, and torture, to have a little bit of dignity, to have the freedom to work, to take care of themselves and their families. That is something so fundamental that our region has not been able to give. So when we talk about rights, justice, and action, you know, we just need to recognize fundamentally the rights of those who have been persecuted. So this is something that's quite important. And I remember when I lived in Australia, when they had the boat people situation up off in the Northern Territory, and they were accusing women of throwing their babies into the water when the boat was sinking. You know, and they just made it sound as though it was such a cynical exercise to get sympathy, when those women were frantically trying to save their children from being sucked into the depths of the ocean when the boat went down. So those kinds of, or they were hoping that someone would at least rescue their children if they don't rescue them. So I think these kinds of situations are situations that are happening in our front yard. Now, what's my origin story? If you were, I'm a sci-fi fan, so you'll talk about superheroes and origin stories. When I was 15, this is back in 1979, I was a schoolgirl, and our school was next to a public bus station, and all of us used that public bus station to go home, especially after school or after sports, you know, extracurricular activities. there was a homeless man who would follow us on the bus and grope us. So when that happened to me, I was extremely upset and I demanded the bus conductor. So you know you're Generation X when you can remember having bus conductors on the buses. Um, so I pressed the bell and demanded, but told the bus conductor, this man has done something wrong to us, and you have to tell the driver to stop the bus and walk him off. And and so my fellow schoolgirls were feeling ashamed and scared, and I'm going like, don't be ashamed. We didn't do anything wrong. He did. He was the one who was wrong, and he should be ashamed. And so the bus conductor let him off the bus, and I followed to make sure he got off. And he turned around and laughed at me. And this 15-year-old girl, I never knew that I was that violent. I actually just out of reflex punched him. So it wasn't a bit not there's no blood or whatever, but he was shocked. And every time he saw me at the bus station, he avoided me, and all my school friends would hide behind me. So I just became like this mother hen. So I did raise it with the school authorities. Now remember, this is the late 70s, different values at the time. And the principal said, well, this is public area. It's not our school grounds. We don't have control. And but we can send the male teachers, there's only 2 male teachers, all girls school, to take shifts for an hour, like after school. So if you have any problems, you can ask them to step in. And so like, that's not gonna work for us. So I actually had, I knew there was there was a national newspaper, an English daily, that had an office near our school. And I met that journalist by accident previously. So I actually went up to the school, the office, and I said, hey, we have a problem. And I proceeded to tell him the problem. And he said, why don't you write it down? And I did. And he edited it, and it came out the next day in the national paper, just a tiny little article. But within 24 hours, everything was solved. The police welfare department went to the bus station, took this guy away. Problem solved. And then the headmistress called me out of class and said, I've been on the phone all day taking calls from parents because of that newspaper article. I know it was you, and that's not the way to solve things. So I politely said, oh, thank you. But then my brain was like, yes, I'm going to be a crime reporter. I'm going to do this. And so
Well done.
I started as a crime reporter. I was still a teenager.
Mm.
As soon as my exams were done, I turned up and said, hey, hire me. And I worked for 2 years as a crime reporter for a national English daily. I started out as a stringer, and I was sufficiently active and learned quickly. And also, I was the only girl crime reporter, so I had a lot of advantages. And I totally, all my competitive spirit came out. I was very happy to scoop all the older men and, get stories where they couldn't. So I did that for 2 years, but it helped me understand that every structure of power is not all powerful. It's made up of people, and you need to know the system and look for loopholes and try and find various means. Don't give up just because it looks big and looks difficult. So, and that's how I got involved in activism. So I came to Australia because my parents were despairing that I was going to be a high school educated, uh, jaded crime reporter with only the cops and mortuary attendants and firefighters as friends. So they bribed me to study in Australia. So they bribed me with a year, the first year of uni in Sydney. And that's also where I became involved in greater human rights movements, including Burma, Burma and Southeast Asian human rights. So that's what's happened. I didn't aim to set up an organization. In fact, when we set up ALTSEAN, I saw it as a 2-year regional campaign back in 1996, and I'm still here. So I often joke that This is the Gilligan's Island version of human rights. We thought we were going for a 2-year tour, and now we're here 30 years later. But I think what's kept me going and what's is the fact that we're constantly reinventing ourselves, and that we've had the honor and the privilege of working with grassroots women. So when Jill, when you said whether they follow in your footsteps, the women I trained, I am following their footsteps. They are doing much more than I ever could. And they're doing it with much more grace and resourcefulness than I have, and a huge amount of heart and generosity. And so when we train women in our organization and we support women, I say, don't think of these women and these young women as our potential peers. We're training them to be our bosses. And we have board members who were trained by us. But very interestingly, 2 years ago, one of our trainers got a job as deputy director at the Karen Peace Support Network. It's a women-led organization that does amazing humanitarian work on the ground with displaced communities in Karen State. And her boss is an alumni of our program.
How is that? That's fantastic. So, question, given the reason you started Alcion, you were saying for advocacy purposes for a period of 2 years is what you anticipated. Has it evolved because it's kept going and it surprised you in that way? Has it evolved on a different trajectory or a different path than you actually could ever have imagined in terms of what it's achieving and what its purpose has become?
Absolutely. In fact, our Women of Burma program that we started in February 1997, we didn't realize at the time it was the first continuous training of women's leadership program in the Burma movement, because there were a series of one-off courses and so on and so forth, but this is a continuous process. And our aim was to connect young women from different ethnic nationalities together. Nur and her other co-executive director, Yasmin Ullah, are really so important to this program, because many of the diverse young women who join the program have not even met a Rohingya woman before. And so to have to connect young women so that they can actually, their worldview is shifted and they are more understanding and inclusive of each other, has really contributed to how women's movements in Burma, Myanmar have been shaped. And that's why we're incredibly inspired and proud that a lot of the women were at the forefront of challenging military impunity for conflict-related sexual violence, and military impunity for land grabbing and other crimes, even during the time of transition. So, all these women are just, basically kick-ass feminists who, despite the lack of resources and the lack of recognition and support, have done such amazing things. So when they come to me and they say, hey, Debbie, we need to lobby you about this, or we need this, or we want to do that, it's just like, it's an honor. It's like, oh, wow, what idea do you have? But one of the projects that I dreamed up, and it was in response, like when we talk about reinventing, we actually have to actively listen to women and say, and they will tell us, we don't even have to say, what do you need? They will tell us what they need and what they want. And that's because we have a position, we actually place trust at the core, we place honesty, and sometimes can be very direct, but it's like, I'm not going to gloss over, I'm not going to be extra polite to you and be sweet to you. I'm going to tell you as it is, because I'm not just going to be accountable to you. I'm going to insist that you're accountable to your community and your organization. So they just come and tell us, we need this, we need that. In 2020, just before COVID hit, one of our alumni, who was the general secretary of the Women's League of Burma, an umbrella group of 13 women's organizations, said, Debbie, we need a feminist for economic policy for Burma because this transition isn't working for us. And we need you to help us out with this. And so we developed this project, but COVID hit, the coup hit in Burma, and many of those women had to go underground. Women, friends of ours, were even assassinated or jailed and tortured. So they couldn't run that program anymore. But in the meantime, we raised funds and we said, look, we've got money for this. Can we go ahead with it? And so the Inclusive Federal Economic Policy Project was really inspiring to us because young people and women from all parts of the country participated. Many of these women who said we don't know anything about economics, they went through a process of demystifying economics, and then they were working with Noor Aziza, with Noor and her colleagues as well, and women leaders with disabilities and the LGBT community, and they drafted 437 economic policy recommendations across 8 sectors for the future development of Burma. And the people who drafted this even included women who were in the People's Defense Forces who were fighting, with young people who were drafting policies in air raid bunkers waiting for airstrikes to hit. And, you know, nearly 70% of the people who drafted these policies were women and non-binary people, and 73% were under the age of 35.
Wow.
So those kinds of things makes me really like, you know, they came to us and they said, we got to do this. And we said, okay, let's see how we can make it happen. And so, you know, I always talk about, you know, when we work, you know, we are pushed into these strategic plans, theory of change, you know, log frame, blah, 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 you know, you know, these 5-year forecasts and, you know, budget, you know, trying to work about resources. And we have to be actually thinking about how can we be agile to change the changing situation on the ground, and how can we be responsive to what people, our peers need, because they're not our beneficiaries, they're our peers and our leaders. What do they want and what do they need, and how can we respond to that? And I think this was one of those magical situations where we tried our best to be responsive, we adjusted, we were agile, and then this amazing thing happened. So that even Professor Surya Deva, who's out at Macquarie University, he's the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Development. And he's asking us, can you please do a template on this so that we can look at whether we can apply this to other country situations, because this is amazing. So, you know, we didn't set out saying, our strategic plan is that we're going to have this groundbreaking, amazing, trailblazing, innovative project. No, it's like, they want this. Let's make this happen.
So if I can ask both you and Noor, Debbie, why do you think, therefore, that, as Noor pointed out, the plight of the Rohingya, let alone the women and the Rohingya women and girls, is so obvious and so significant? Why do you think it's not more prominent, whether that's within ASEAN or whether it's more globally? Why is it not closer to the top of what everyone's paying? And I know there's a lot going on in the world, but why is it not more prominent in terms of the considerations, in terms of what people are thinking of globally, whether it be in terms of in a humanitarian framework or whatever? Why does it not feature more?
There's a fundamental allergy amongst legislators and governments, and particular bureaucrats. They're extremely allergic to the idea of refugees and asylum seekers coming into their front yard and backyard. when the nature of our human history is that we always grew when we welcomed refugees. So I think this whole securitization of the issue of seeing refugees and asylum seekers as a burden, as a threat to security, as destabilizing, is really a nasty way and a very, very nasty habit that everyone has adopted. I'm not accusing Australia, but even the UK recently put a visa ban on students from Myanmar, from Burma. But Malaysia has got thousands of Rohingya women and children basically in indefinite detention. Basically, refugees are seen as ATMs on two legs because any cop, anyone in a uniform, even some ridiculous person in Rela, which is actually in Malaysia a volunteer local security, supposed to be neighborhood watch. You press the refugee and you get money out of them. So they're very, very vulnerable. And there's this whole thing about let's not give refugees the right to live. Let's not give them the right to work. Let's put them tight. Let's lock them up in a camp or some detention area, and then give them basic rations, and hopefully we can push them back to where they were subjected to genocide. So I think we really need to open our minds. People are always there's a whole a global propaganda exercise that continually reinforces the fact that harps on our fear that we don't have enough to share with others. When actually, if you go to a refugee camp, if you are privileged enough to be welcomed by a refugee community, you're not sharing with them, they are sharing with you. So I think we do need to have this mind shift. We've been so socialized and so brainwashed that any outsider, anyone who's different is a threat to our resources and to what we have when we don't recognize that in Australia, in Malaysia, and a lot of places, if refugees are allowed to work, they actually bring in billions more revenue into the economy. There's actually very sound economic reasons to actually welcome refugees, but that's not the story. And then I work in corporate accountability, and when we look at the fact that even now, when there's a civil war going on in Burma, there's an Australian company engaged in mining in a conflict area. That actually, when we look at the root causes of many of these conflicts, it's our companies and our governments that contributed to those conflicts and helped create those refugees. So I think we are fundamentally connected. And so when I feel kind of embarrassed and guilty whenever Nur acknowledges me, because I just think I'm a Malaysian. Malaysians did horrible shit to you. They continue to do horrible, terrible things to refugees in Malaysia and undocumented migrants, and they criminalize survivors of genocide. And whether it's Australia or Malaysia or Thailand or anywhere else or Indonesia, by persecuting Rohingya, we are actually perpetuating and intensifying the impacts of the genocide. So I think that's something that we have to understand and have to acknowledge. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I think that is really important to understand. That people see helping out refugees is something you put, we're now having Christian Lent, so you put in an extra $5 in the collection plate for the refugees. But the thing is that we can't separate ourselves from refugees. And at this point, looking at how climate change is unfolding and all of those terrible things that are happening around the world, we could be a refugee any moment. Trump has taught us a very bitter lesson that nobody is safe. All of us have been living under an illusion of safety. And we do need to be resilient, and that resilience means also being inclusive. Sorry, I've ranted.
No. All very good points. That's very true. And it gives us a really good picture of what's going on. Nor your thoughts about that. And in terms of, as I said, why is this not being more highlighted?
I think as a result of multiple inaction and events, it has caused a ripple effect where people don't have any information about the Rohingya, or there is a lack of urgency for Rohingya, especially for Rohingya women. It looks different in different regions. I visit ASEAN quite frequently. I visit the Rohingya refugee camps in Indonesia. There are 7 Rohingya refugee camps in Aceh, and people don't even know that. When I tell them that, they're like, there are refugee camps in Indonesia. And one of them is literally on the beach with no rooftop, 40-degree heat, no education for the children, women prone to gender-based violence. And when I visit ASEAN and Malaysia, Indonesia in particular, there is the rise of hate speech, misinformation, disinformation. According to hateful and racist Malaysians and Indonesians, Rohingya are ungrateful. Rohingya get free food, free 5-star hotel, like Ayana in Bali. We get free housing, free everything. And that some people might say that we are these aliens that want to steal Malaysian and Indonesian land, that we were created by the United States, all sorts of rubbish that I've seen in the last few years by real people. People might say these are bot accounts, but no, when I look into it, a lot of them are real accounts, cute pictures of everyday Indonesians and Malaysians that are posting such hateful rhetoric against Rohingya, saying that we're too black, saying that we are these ugly monkeys. And that's just a factor where the hate has just brewed so much that the public just don't want us there. They want us back in genocide. They tell us to go back. And this is something we've had to combat as an organization. I fear for my life when I go to Indonesia and Malaysia. I'm very careful to tell people whether I'm a Rohingya or not. And I've had so many encounters of this, which I can share another time because it's so long. But then when it comes to Australia, when I'm here, I feel like people don't even know Myanmar exists. I know I do a lot of talks in Australia. I go to schools, I go to primary school, high school, university. I've been doing talks for International Women's Day, and they're like, what's Myanmar? What's Burma? Is that in Thailand? And it's just so bizarre to me because it's in our region, it's in the backyard. And if you look at the media as well, when did Australian media ever cover Myanmar? The last time the Australian media covered Myanmar was about the bloody earthquake.
Yeah.
Nothing about the bombings, nothing about the killings, nothing about the crazy Min Aung Hlaing, nothing about the International Court of Justice. The hearing literally happened 2 months ago. So these multiple layers are causing that ripple effect for people to not care. And I think the perpetrators of the Rohingya genocide, the Myanmar military, are not popular enough. They're not universally hated. And just because they're not universally hated like the Israeli military, it doesn't mean they are not evil.
No.
Well, like who's killing the Rohingya? And we know that Petronas business, they were doing business with Myanmar military, and then they got caught and they said, "Oh my God, we're gonna take our money out." We know Indonesian state government still provides weapons to Myanmar military, and they're also committing genocide in West Papua. And when we talk about these factors to everyday Malaysians, Indonesians, they have a heart attack. the patriotism comes out. They're like, oh no, my country is not like this. My country is not like that. No, actually, you're doing exactly what Israel's doing.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's yeah. You have to question the role of how much is enough advocacy. I mean, you can never have too much advocacy, but especially in the way it addresses misinformation and disinformation. That's the problem. That's the bigger problem in terms of keeping these things front and centre. It doesn't matter how many things we've got going on around the world, that all the plights should be front and centre. Jules, I'm going to come to you now and broaden it out a little bit in terms of Hagar International and looking at the theme for International Women's Day this year and talking about balancing those scales and that urgent need for fairer, more inclusive and accessible justice for women and girls around the world. What sort of view do you get as part of Hagar International in terms of the work that's being done along those lines, in terms of addressing the issues of inaccessible justice and that low level of fairness, if any? What are you seeing from that point of view in terms of the work Hagar International does?
Thank you, Jill. I'd like to start first with just a little story.
Yeah,
and
sure.
It's not necessarily my story, but several years ago in Thailand, a young survivor of trafficking sat in a courtroom facing a man who had exploited her. She was frightened, traumatized, and uncertain whether the system would protect her. Standing beside her was a lawyer. I'm going to call her Pick, and she's a colleague of mine from Thailand, an amazing, powerful little woman that's a pocket rocket. And she's also like a stand-up comedian. I don't know how she does what she does. So Pick had spent several months working with the survivor, helping her understand the legal process, ensuring investigators gathered the right evidence, and preparing a case that would not only prosecute the perpetrator, but also secure compensation for the harm done. When the case concluded, the survivor received financial compensation that helped cover medical care, mental health treatment, and the support she needed to rebuild her life. For Pick, that moment represented something important, not just justice for one survivor, but a small shift in the balance of power. And so, talking about tonight's theme, balancing the scales, it draws attention really to the urgent need for fairer, more inclusive, as we've been talking about inclusion, and accessible justice systems for women and girls. And despite the decades of progress that's taken place, and for those that have been working in this area long before myself, millions of women and girls, despite this, are still facing enormous barriers when seeking justice after violence, trafficking, or exploitation. That's not only in Thailand and in the Mekong region, which is where Hagar predominantly works, and Afghanistan, but it's also in the US and it's in Australia. Many will never report the crimes committed against them. Many are not believed, and many encounter systems that were never designed for their needs in mind. At Hagar International, our mission is to end trafficking, slavery, and abuse by supporting survivors, preventing exploitation, and pursuing justice. Tonight, I wanted to share a little bit about our work specifically in Thailand, but also it's been wonderful to hear about the work in Burma, Myanmar. We partner with an organization called YKBWA, Yangon Cayenne Baptist Women's Association, who is doing the type of work that we do in other countries. And our Vietnam team has traveled in and out of Yangon, providing training, peer-to-peer training on these issues. So in Thailand, Hagar is operating with an organization called LIFT, and LIFT now has become part of Hagar, which is very exciting. And LIFT really has focused on just how justice systems can begin to rebalance the scale for survivors. So they've really invested. So every case of human trafficking, sexual exploitation results in trauma. Survivors often experience profound physical, emotional, and psychological trauma. Recovery requires long-term support, medical care, mental health services, safe housing, legal protection. Yet historically, the justice systems have focused predominantly or entirely on one thing, and that's prosecuting the perpetrator, which is good. While criminal prosecution is essential, survivors' needs are often overlooked. Sorry, I've got Invisalign, and I find I have a hard time speaking sometimes, so excuse me with the stutters.
Fine, that's absolutely fine.
And things are beginning to change. For many years, little attention was paid to civil rights of survivors, and I suspect Debbie and Nora can speak to this. Their right to compensation, rehabilitation, and long-term recovery. And lawyers like Pick have played an important role in this shift. Pick's been doing this since 2014, so she's got a decade under her belt, and I think she's 20. She's older than that, but she's young. She represents survivors of human trafficking and exploitation in Thailand, and her work goes beyond criminal prosecutions. She also helps survivors file claims for the financial compensation from the perpetrators themselves. And she works with a multidisciplinary team. They have a psychologist and a social worker that also works with them. And they have really been educating the courts about the mental injury that can't be seen. And they have innovated on a psychological assessment tool, which helps to document the psychological injury to survivors. And this is really changing the terms and the terms of prosecution, as well as the amount of compensation being received. Of course, money can't undo the trauma that survivors have endured, but it can help provide a pathway forward. And it sounds a powerful message that the harm done to survivors matters and perpetrators must be held accountable. And I think accountability and how we change the system. So when PIC began about a decade ago, the reality was very different. Compensation existed in theory, but rarely in practice. Justice systems, as I said, were focused on perpetrators. And even more troubling were the attitudes around trafficking victims or survivors. Some questioned whether victims had made choices or the survivors had made choices that put them in that. And we see that in our own courts, as well as in the courts such as Thailand. Others believed harmful stereotypes about women involved in sexual exploitation. And the trauma itself was poorly understood, and I think it still is for the most part. Today, thanks in part to Pick and the team, though, the system is changing. And not only is the system in the courts changing, but law enforcement is becoming more aware for the need for trauma-informed approaches to investigations. And I find this really exciting. And what Pick and the team are doing in Thailand, it's changing things. And one of the most important changes is the way investigations are conducted. So traditionally, when police carry out trafficking arrests, their focus was understandably on catching criminals and the baddies, but little thought was given to the survivor experience when they got caught in the midst of the raids or the arrests. Imagine the situation for a trafficking victim. Police arrive, make arrests. You're the victim or the survivor. You're frightened and traumatized, and you may have been manipulated for years into believing that police can't be trusted. And now they're here. And suddenly you're questioned, sometimes even in the presence of the very person who has exploited you. That experience alone is secondary trauma for many women and girls. So Lift, Hagar, has advocated and is advocating for a different approach, and it's trauma-informed investigative work. So whenever possible, social workers and lawyers are present during the investigations and arrests, and victims are separated from the perpetrators and receive immediate care and support. And lawyers like Pick ensure their rights are protected from the very beginning of the process. And this multidisciplinary approach is really helping law enforcement better understand how to engage. And one of the key things, and I'm sure everyone on this call, and it goes along with Debbie, what you're saying, is we need to listen. And here it's listening to survivors. Pick says what drives her work is simple. I see them, I feel their pain. I think compensation is really important to them. I'll do everything to help them. Her goal is not to win cases, but to ensure the government institutions themselves increasingly recognize and defend the rights of survivors. She often speaks at government training, sharing survivor experience so that police, prosecutors, and officials better understand. Because when institutions listen to survivors, I think we'll see systems begin to change more quickly. And that brings me to something, if I can take just a few more minutes.
No, by all means, yep.
And this is something that many people around the world are familiar with. And this is the recent release of additional Epstein documents that has exposed one of the most disturbing failures of justice, I would say, in recent decades. And there's a gentleman, maybe some of you actually know him, Nick Grono. He's the CEO of the Freedom Fund. He recently wrote, what's most shocking about the Epstein case is not simply the abuse itself, but that it happened for years in plain sight. Survivors spoke out, their voices were ignored, and the immense power surrounding Epstein, his wealth, his influence, his elite networks, created enormous barriers to accountability. Imagine being one of the young women with little power or resources attempting to bring allegations against a man connected to billionaires, political elites, as well as global elites. The imbalance of power was staggering and is staggering. And that imbalance allowed exploitation to continue for far longer than it should have. So when institutions fail to listen to survivors, I would say abuse flourishes. So this is not just an American or a Thai story. Trafficking and exploitation occur wherever power imbalances exist. And Hagar sees this in the places where we work, where perpetrators believe they're untouchable, where survivors are not believed, where justice systems hesitate to investigate powerful, influential people. If justice systems are serious about protecting women and girls, they must ensure that power and status never shield perpetrators from accountability. So, this is why tonight's theme for me, rebalancing the scale, is so important. Justice systems must actively work to correct these imbalances. That means to listen to survivors or to the refugees, to those that are experiencing whatever the exploitation is, protecting their rights, their human rights that are undeniable, ensuring investigations are thorough, providing legal representation, and holding perpetrators accountable regardless of their influence or status. Let me close just with this thought. Survivors of trafficking and exploitation, from the brief engagement I've had here at Hagar for the last year, show extraordinary courage. We have a survivors alumni network that is so powerful, and these women are standing up and saying, we are going to engage and do the advocacy and change the systems. They speak out against powerful abusers. They have relived trauma in courtrooms. They demand accountability from systems that once failed them. The least we can do is to ensure these systems begin to listen, among all the other things that these incredible women who have spoken before me are working on. Because when survivors are heard, when justice systems take their experiences seriously, when perpetrators are held accountable, then the scales begin to balance. And that balance is essential if we're to build a world where women and girls can live free from exploitation, violence, and abuse. Thanks, Jill, for giving me that opportunity.
No, no, absolutely our pleasure, Jules. And so much of what you said there is just very thought-provoking in terms of you can see the positives out of it, but it's such a big task that they're only incremental, perhaps, but nevertheless positives. And one of the things I was initially going to ask you was about the impact when you talk about Pick's original case, about the impact that had, if any, because we're talking about not just criminal, but the expansion into looking at human impact. But from what you've said from that point, from telling us about Pick's first case, was about obviously there are those positive outcomes, but they might only be happening incrementally. But the fact that you've addressed the issue of trauma and of victims and brought that to the notice of governments and authorities and the justice system seems to be making those positive steps. Like I say, they may only seem like small steps, but you must be pleased with the direction, at least, in which that's going in terms of addressing those issues of accessibility and of justice becoming that little bit fairer, perhaps. Like there's so much more to do, but do you see that you can obviously see those outcomes and be pleased with the fact that you're heading in the right direction and the work that you're doing and others like you are doing are heading in the right direction?
I think it produces hope. And when you have the opportunity to engage with the survivors who have been walking with Hagar for some of them, in the early years, and Hagar's been around for 30 years. So some of these were very young girls, and you see what they're doing and how they're changing their own communities, and how Pick's work in Chiang Mai is changing the way the courts view mental injury and how they engage with women and children, how they protect children in court, giving them options to give their witness or their testimony via camera versus having to go into the court. And that's all because of the work of people standing up and saying, we need to care for these people and not re-traumatize them through this process. So I think there's courage. Well, I find courage in what I see, but I really find hope that things can change and are changing in some places. But at the same time, and one of the evolving, challenging areas of exploitation and abuse is the scam centers. And the scam centers in the Mekong region that are recruiting people through what appears to be legitimate job ads. Then you go for your job, they take your passport, and you're now basically imprisoned in a scam center. And they're the ones calling us in Australia saying, would you like to buy or what have you, in how we are getting scammed. And then when those governments are busting these scam centers, these individuals have been exploited and, in essence, a form of modern slavery. They're then being arrested for perpetrating the crime of scamming because of the cost and the labor intensive assessment of individuals to determine who is a criminal and who is actually a victim of exploitation. And so Hagar is working on that with law enforcement as well. And how do you determine to ensure those people who have been abused and exploited and in horrible ways get access to the services they need versus being criminalized? And that's a new challenge. And these individuals, criminal networks that are running these, they're very clever. Tech is getting ahead of us. And so how can we keep up with that? And the justice systems and our legislation are slow in comparison. So the challenges remain, but there is hope in the midst.
So the justice systems, from what you just described, the justice systems are in fact, or are they in fact, identifying, as you say, the scammers that are then being raided and arrested, that they are in fact also victims of, as modern slavery, as modern slaves, I guess, modern slavery. Is the justice system then going after the organisational, as they would say, for instance, go after, well, it is human trafficking, but as they would go after the bigger threat or the bigger issue, are they now looking to drive into that as well instead of just focusing on the scammers themselves?
It's extremely complicated because let's go back to the powerful and the elite.
Mm.
And, in my own mind, I was like, well, why don't governments just turn off electricity? Why don't they turn off internet access to this? Why can't they do this? Well, it's corruption at the highest levels. It's loopholes in systems. And the criminals are advancing faster than those control systems and the justice systems are. So, yes, the intent is after the big guns who are driving these things. And this is where it takes more than a sole government, because this is cross-border, it's cross-region. I believe it's connected to also drug trade. It's connected to a lot of nefarious things. So where drugs are moving, people are being moved. Where money and power exist, people are exploiting. And it just has changed now, not now, but it has been evolving to where these scamming centers, Amnesty International has done some incredible work uncovering. And if people want to know more, I'd refer them to looking at what Amnesty produced in Cambodia as a report. It's really challenging and dangerous work.
So expanding that, is there enough going on cross-border in terms of internationally, in terms of the policing and the justice perspective? Because from what you're saying, it's not contained by borders, and not even just contained necessarily within the Asian region. So is this being looked at or worked on quite significantly on an international justice system perspective?
I would say, to my knowledge, in some places, certain governments have bilateral and multilateral relations where they share information, they share resources, and they coordinate activities. And with that kind of coordination, they can be more successful. The Australian Federal Police are doing different things in the region. We have the UN UNDOC office. You have Interpol, who works on this and sharing intelligence. You've got now with America and the TIP report, and basically the new administration, not so new, but the administration and how they view different things. I think that collaboration could be not as strong as it was before the administration change. And then in the European network is very different than what we see down in the Asia Pacific. But it's all connected. So it's one big, massive problem. When we think that I think the statistics are now, it's over 50 million people are exploited or enslaved at the moment.
They're incredible numbers. I mean, they're mind-blowing numbers when you think about it. I guess the question or the thought we all have then is, as long as globally, especially the justice system globally, are aware of it, and obviously they are, but are doing enough to address it. It's a big, big task, but I guess that's our question: is there enough being done to address whether they're making significant inroads? Inroads, but is it being addressed? So. Yeah,
more needs to be done.
Yeah.
More needs to be done. Yeah. And when we look at, and this kind of comes back to your question for me on fragility, and when we see what's happening in the Middle East, And the resources that have been cut, the increased vulnerability that's going to occur. For example, in Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict has reared its head. Iran, Pakistan pushing Afghans back into Afghanistan with nothing, women and girls.
Yeah.
When they cross those borders, they are at increased risk for exploitation and various hazardous things to take place. Hagar is working hard to be there. However, if we think about what's in the news today, raising resources to equip these teams is extremely challenging because there's so much demand even to be able to feed people. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of food, shelter, and water, and the conflicts that are occurring in the world, and the limited amount of humanitarian assistance, I think, how creative can I be? And where am I finding the individuals who are passionate about these issues, have the resources that can direct to bolster the capability or capacities to respond to these issues? And for such a time as now, we should be pouring more money into that. But the dollar is stretched.
Yeah.
And
And
it's
it makes
easy
you,
to understand somebody needs to be fed and
yeah.
that they need water. It's more difficult to talk about trauma and the healing on that because you can't always see it.
And it also makes you realize how hugely significant the impact of the slashing of USAID funding is around the world, given it, from memory, and I could be wrong about this, it covered about 60% or more of the actual aid, humanitarian aid and financial aid funding going around the world for in the development sector. And it's pretty much been totally slashed, or almost.
Yep.
So yeah, horrifying, really. I wanted to Debbie, back to you to talk about, you were talking about the policies that have been driven by these women, 400 and something policies in that night. I wanted to ask you about what's the next step for driving those policies. And I'm asking that on the basis that I wanted to explore a little bit in the time we've got left about the shift towards balancing the scales and the work being done. Both you and Noor talked about the women-led initiatives and that capacity building for women's leadership. You talked about those policies being developed, which is fantastic. With that as an example, what's the next step for something like that in terms of their possible outcomes? Where do they go once they've drafted policies and put them in? What happens next in terms of pursuing the whole idea of balancing the scales and having a fairer system for women?
Thanks, Jill. I just wanted to take this opportunity to follow up on something that Jill said about transnational crime, because when we talk about the conflict, China recently executed members of one of the scammer families, and the four top families on the Chinese Burma border that had been running scam centers and human trafficking and drugs were acknowledged by the junta leader, the junta boss, the Burma junta boss, as a friend of Myanmar. And they actually make money out of this, and they play a game with China. When China turns on the heat, then they might launch an airstrike or do a raid, but those people have already moved. And you just go on Google Earth and see who has the lights on at night on the Thai-Burmese China border, and you'll have an idea of where the scam centers are.
Yeah.
But the thing,
Exactly. Thank you, Debbie.
the big challenge we have with Interpol is that the red notices of Interpol is misused by the military regime of Burma, as well as China and other repressive states. They abuse this red notice in the Interpol that you can actually get arrested. A couple of years ago, a young footballer refugee from Australia went to see his family in Thailand, and the repressive regime he fled had put his name on the red notice. So Interpol, Thai authorities arrested him, and Craig Foster had to come over to Thailand to get him back. So, so we do have an issue around how Interpol operates. But I think the most heartbreaking is that the Ta'ang Women's Organization, they are a small ethnic group in Shan State. They went to the UNODC back in 2007, 2008 and said, since the military has entered our area, there's been a big boom in growing opium, and there's been a diversification into methamphetamine production. Our young people are suffering, people are getting addicted. We really need to address it. What can you do? And UNODC said, we only work with governments. We don't work with community. And actually, if you go to Ta'ang Women's Organization website, these lovely young women, very shy, very soft-spoken, actually did some hardcore ground truthing. They actually mapped out which areas in their place were growing opium. And it was called Poison Hills. And then there was another, after this election in 2010, the military actually got a drug lord to be elected to parliament. And this drug lord was able to increase his opium acreage by 300%. And these women went and showed exactly where it was. And it's called, another report called Still Poisoned. So these women have also got a poison flower. So they've done a series of 3 reports that extensively ground truth. UNODC has not been there. And they say, no, we can't do anything about this because we only work with states. So we do have a huge problem. I don't know if it's a colonial mentality or it's thinking about working with peers state to state or regime to regime. But the reality is that women on the ground are documenters. They are doing the documentation. They are the drug production investigators. They are the scam center investigators, but then they are targeted selectively. Yeah. So I think we do need to come back to, it's not, people say, where are the women, or we have to train them up. I can say I have provided training, and the training has not, we didn't have to subject people to a master's coursework or anything like that. We had to be quite clear and understand and respect the lived experience and their knowledge, the local knowledge. And then when they had the confidence, they actually came up with policies, they came up with solutions, because this is the problem they're living with. So when we talk about what next, well, the women in Karenni state, Karenni is a small state, also known as Kaya state. In 2023, they set up a revolutionary government called the Interim Executive Council. And one of the things that happened was they insisted inclusion of 30% women's leadership in executive, legislative, and judiciary. And they've already achieved 27%, and they say that's not enough. And that was from the get-go. And the women who were involved in this project went to the IEC and said, and advocated successfully to adopt the health and education policy that they drafted. So we're actually seeing, even in areas where there are airstrikes, young people actually raising awareness about these different policies that they're espousing and going and talking to political stakeholders saying, we want this. The Women's Advocacy Coalition went to this the National Unity Consultative Council and took the taxation policy that was developed and said, this is what taxation should look like. So we already see that people are just running with this. Nur Aziz's organization actually had workshops in the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar to help young people understand what these policies were about and to get them to think how do we build the future? And this is something that's very hopeful in this time of, it's basically 1,000 military attacks, military clashes, armed clashes and attacks on civilians a month. 1,000, and at least 100, sometimes 200 airstrikes a month happening mainly at civilian targets, at internally displaced camps, at places of worship, clinics, and so on. So, people are still people are suffering, but there's still a lot of people thinking, what are we going to do in the future? So they're doing this. We've been really, really inspired because people are very keen to think, okay, what do we want for our future? What kind of living how do we want to live? How do we rebuild this country without causing more conflict and more displacement? So those kinds of questions help young people and women focus, and they go like, okay, this is what we're fighting for. And, all this pain and suffering and tragedy, there's just been reports of a massacre that happened a couple of days ago in Karen State. All dealing with this trauma and dealing with this death and horrific human rights violations. They're basically war crimes, but people go like, okay, but after that, we still have to think about what comes after. So I think uh, we see people are still working hard. People are still talking to us and saying, can you talk to us about this? So my colleague, Sue, who's really amazing. I mean, she's so amazing that everybody loves her, that they actually meet their deadlines. If I set a deadline, nobody will bother. But they actually are coming forward and say, we want to do this next. We want to talk about this other thing next. We want to go and do outreach to those folks. Send us a video, send us your materials. So there's a Facebook page in Burmese that puts out the training videos and shares about these policies, because Facebook is hugely popular in Burma. It actually uses less bandwidth, internet bandwidth, but also we've been smuggling copies of the policies and the videos on USB. So in places where internet is not accessible, people are actually watching things on. So we are bootlegging. We've got bootleg USBs. So we said, okay, those scammers, they're smuggling people, they're doing all these things, they're dealing with illicit things, and we're dealing with illicit educational materials. So so that's happening. So it is a horrific outlook globally in terms of the aid sector and the development sector. There's no appetite. It's not just the US. Sweden has abandoned its feminist development policy. Netherlands also, that used to really fund a lot of feminist initiatives. And Germany has been very shaky. They've been cutting back. So we can see there's this uncertainty, but we also have to acknowledge that a lot of this work is done for very little money by women on the ground.
Yeah.
And they want to have that opportunity to keep on doing that work. So, if you're talking about cost effectiveness, listening to women on the ground and making sure that they can get the job done is much more cost effective and much more sustainable at the community level.
Yeah, and that's where it does become a classic example, doesn't it, of power versus grassroots activism. It is absolutely a classic example of that. Thanks for that, Debbie. We're going to wrap up shortly with some questions and answers. I have one question I just want to wrap up with, Noor. Just a quick question about the work you're doing with your organisation. Do you see progress, given that we're talking about balancing the scales and the pursuit of justice and accessibility for women and girls? Do you see progress in that pursuit at any level through the work you're doing?
Absolutely. I mean, justice cannot only exist in international courts, it can also mean everyday lives of survivors. So when I think of justice, I think about all the women we work across in the region. I think about the 6 Rohingya women in Indonesia who were raped by the human trafficker and later gave birth from that violence. So, I mean, justice also means they're not abandoned, that they're listened to and their voices are heard. We had a particular case a few months ago where a Rohingya woman, a young girl, fell pregnant out of wedlock from her boyfriend. And the locals found out. What the locals did is they went outside of the refugee camp in Aceh and they were protesting and screaming for her to get out because they saw her as like a shaitan, which means the devil, in and they said that she doesn't belong in Aceh and that she should be burnt alive. And they demanded that she be out or they will burn the entire refugee camp to the ground that has hundreds of Rohingya women, children, men, boys. So we had to send some funds. Mind you, we're not a large humanitarian refugee-led organization. None of us are on pay. We're all volunteers. We all have our own lives. We all have our jobs. But again, this comes from the need to speak for our people. And it also comes from a place of privilege. I'm relatively very privileged compared to many other Rohingya women. So we sent some funding to Indonesia and we were able to put her in a safe house. And then the locals realized she was not there anymore. And then they stopped harassing the Rohingya refugees. Some of the Rohingya refugees told me that when they get out of the camp just to buy coriander or a couple of tomatoes, people would go to them and beat them up. And this is something many Rohingya women face when they're just collecting food for their children. So I think when we talk about justice, it means supporting them with dignity and care. It means telling their stories and that their children are not treated as invisible. It means protection. And right now we know Rohingya women are very much not protected in the region. So we go to the region, we speak to policymakers, we speak with Indonesian government, we speak with Malaysian government, we speak with civil society, and we do what we can. So really, justice means the possibility of a future for all of the Rohingya children, where children are not born stateless, where women who survive violence are able to rebuild their lives. And at times you want to give up because you look at the news and you see horrors upon horrors in Sudan, in Congo, in West Papua, in Gaza, in Ukraine, Iran, you name it. But then what motivates me the most is when I think about the women in the Rohingya refugee camp who literally have nothing, just tarp over their head. They still hope for a brighter future, not for themselves, but for their children. And when I think about that, I think, wow, like me as a Rohingya in Australia, carrying a passport, so privileged, so easy for me to turn off and just say, hey, I just want to go to the Sydney Opera House and enjoy a day with my family, which is fine. Which is fine.
No, I can understand that, yeah.
But we have a moral responsibility for our community, especially as survivors. But we cannot do this work alone. We need outsiders to also intervene and also speak about the Rohingya, because the Rohingya are still being persecuted. Rohingya are still facing genocide. People are escaping bombings, rape, torture. It is still happening. Just because the media has moved on, it does not mean the genocide has moved on.
No, thank you for that, Noor. You're absolutely right. And it's there just isn't enough. We need so much advocacy and so much raising of voices for all these issues, but especially, as you say, the Rohingya issue is well underreported and undervalued as an issue, as a major issue. I will wrap up our discussion there and throw open to questions. If anybody has a question, either open your microphone and ask or put a hand up. That would be fine for any of our 3 guests. Please take the opportunity to do so. now. If not, I'll throw to Chris, but if anyone has a question, please go ahead. No question. What I will mention is also in the chat box, you may notice that our guests have also put up videos and links, really good videos and links to videos and links to sites to have a look at. And I urge you to take note of those. Thank you very much for putting those up. Debbie, especially, like all those links and that, really important, and be good to follow them up. So I'm sure our wonderful WiAD volunteers who are also on the call will be noting those all down for us to follow through and to promote for you and have a look at. But yes, like I say, if there's any questions, please ask. Otherwise, Chris, I will throw over to you.
Mm-hmm. And I will make sure that those links and pieces are circulated afterwards so others can read them. So we had a couple of questions in the registration. Now, some of these may already be partly covered, so don't feel you have to answer them. So Elena sent one to say, for organisations focused on rights-based and livelihood programming, but choosing not to engage in advocacy, what forms of support or collaboration are the most appropriate for them? And how can partners enhance their impact while still fully respecting their strategic boundaries? I'll throw that open for whether Nor or Debbie or Jules would like to answer that.
It's a technical question about big organizations. I'm a big mouth and I don't like being told to not say certain things, which is why I don't work for anyone. I'm not contracted with anybody at all. So I can say whatever I want, and that's the benefit of not being attached to big organizations like the UN or UN Women or Australian government or any other sectors. And I'm a bit stubborn and I'm trying to keep it this way, but hopefully the funding cuts don't make me go through LinkedIn and apply for these jobs.
But can you see any potential for having like stakeholder partners, whether it be for funding or for more, I don't know, logistical or other purposes? Is there any need? Do you have a need for that, or
Absolutely,
can you see a purpose for that in what you're doing?
There's such a huge, like Debbie said, there's such a huge global humanitarian funding cut. Debbie's organization's been alive for so long, and she's faced the brunt of this, where some of her staff she had to let them go or cut their programming. And I've seen this with other organizations such as Manusha in Bangkok. 80% of the funding was slashed, and they do really vital work helping survivors that have escaped, even within the Rohingya community. And it's just heartbreaking because at the end of the day, we are serving people. We are serving really, really vulnerable people. And without money, we can't have the machinery move. So yes, we do need as much support as possible.
Okay. Actually, we've been very lucky because we've had some severe cuts, but everyone gets underpaid anyway. How our budget was traditionally structured was about 60% of our budget actually went into activities and partners on the ground. Okay. So we had a 50% cut, and we were still able to retain staff, but when people left, we didn't replace them. So that is the process that we've had to do. But when we go back on rights-based livelihood work, I think there's a lot of work that can be done strategically, even for groups that do want to work behind the scenes. In fact, there are a number of organizations, including the Rohingya Myanmar Collaborative Network, that were able to get resources into situations of emergency when UN agencies and INGOs said we can't. and they were able to get packets of money and resources in. There was second wave. There's been a second wave of genocide in Arakan state. This time, Rohingya are sandwiched between the Arakan army, who's been committing atrocity crimes against them, as well as the military junta. And Rohingya are even being forcibly recruited, conscripted by both sides, and forced to kill each other, essentially. So when this wave, when a fresh wave of refugees hit the Bangladesh border, they were stuck in this river, and what they call no man's land, this sand island, and the UN said we can't get there because the Bangladesh authorities don't allow us, and the INGO said we can't get there because we got no permission. Well, Noor Aziza and her sisters said, fuck permission, we're getting money there. And they actually went and scraped together some funds, found local people that they trusted, and got supplies into people. So I think this is why we actually need to question with INGOs and the aid community. Sometimes we become like corporations. Bigger is better. We're continually talking about expansion and doing various things. And what we're trying to do is try to operate on an anti-gatekeeping basis, which is why Noor Aziza loves us so much, because we're anti-gatekeepers. We say, look, who do you want to talk to? You go and have I will connect you and go and have your conversations with them. And if people want to talk to the Rohingya women, yes, go here. We ask permission. Are you interested in talking to them? Okay, now we hand over. You don't have to tell us what you're doing. Just call us if there's a problem. So it actually is energy efficient, because anti-gatekeeping means you are trusting people to go off and get stuff done. You just have to connect them, number one. Number two, there is kind of a colonialistic mentality that we must, the amount of money that we are spending on monitoring and evaluation by sending a foreign so-called qualified person to go and observe the aid that's being delivered is actually a little bit crazy, because there are people on the ground who can give you the documentation. They can even give you live video, a live feed, so you don't have to worry about that. And we don't deal with a lot of funding, but what we've found is we tried this innovative strategy. We piloted it and we found it works so well. We try to use it across the board, and we don't do subgrants. No subgrants. We do mini consultancies. So these are consultancies. So when we have a project, we actually build them in a modular fashion and say, we'd like to, you are interested in this project and we'd like to work with you, but we're not going to force you to marry us for the whole life of this project. We're going to date strategically. So this is what we're going to do. This phase is one consultancy. This phase is another consultancy. This phase is another consultancy. So you join this phase, we are only focused on the deliverables and the deadline. If you have a problem meeting your deadline because it's a conflict zone, don't worry, come and talk to us and we'll try and make something work. Don't collect receipts, because if you get receipts, your receipts are intercepted at a military checkpoint, you could be killed or people could be arrested. It's your discretion, but please sign this waiver that you're not going to use it to commit human rights violations or commit violence. And then how you manage the money is at your discretion. And how you please manage the risk properly. Do not take unnecessary risk, and come back to us once you've achieved the deliverables. And then if you think you have the capacity to continue doing this, the situation on the ground allows you, your internal situation allows you, then you can take the second phase. So we found that the
Thank you.
feedback from people has been so amazing, and they actually continue to want to work with us, and they've been much more productive. And we also get saved the headache of having to audit their work. So it's more
That's
of an equal power dynamic. Okay, I gotta
yeah,
go.
that's great. Thank you, Debbie. Jules had her hand up there to add a little bit, I think, to that.
So I was just going to comment on what I understood a part of the question was about being a rights-based, livelihood-focused organization that's doing operations and not advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I'd like to encourage them to think about, and this is something for Hagar, and first I should say, Hagar's teams in all of our countries are fully national. They're complete. It's Vietnamese, it's Cambodian, it's Thai, and it's Afghan. And we don't have expats in any of our programs in those offices. And that can make it really challenging to speak out and be able to maintain your ability to operate. So, depending on the organization that's doing the rights-based livelihoods work, it's maybe that's exactly what you need to focus on, and you need to find the entity that can do the advocacy on your behalf, whether it's someone like Noor or Debbie, because we need all the parts of the system. And so if you're able to do great work and can't advocate, that doesn't mean your work isn't valuable. And we need people who can operate on the ground, and we need people who can speak out. And sometimes you can't do both. Sometimes you can, depending on the risks and the environment where you are. So be encouraged, not discouraged. Find your links to where you can get your messages out to others that are in a position to advocate. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Jules.
So perhaps one more question I've got here. The in approaching justice for women and girls, how can we ensure intersectional power dynamics are considered and engaged with meaningfully? Who'd like to have a go with that one?
Intersectionality, always an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Okay.
No?
I'm really a fan of intersectionality. And I think we just have to also, whenever we go into a space, we really have to be proactive in thinking who's in the room and who's not.
Mm-hmm.
Who's in the room and who's not.
Yes.
And why are they not in the room, and what can we do?
Yeah.
So like with the Inclusive Federal Economic Policy Project, we started the first round of workshops, and then we were just sitting down having a review, and I realized that we only had one Chin ethnic person engaged in the process. And we said, okay, we've got to look for the Chin. And we realized that there was a Chin refugee community in India, in Delhi, and on the border area, and a Chin refugee community in Kuala Lumpur that we had also been in touch with. So we called them. We couldn't fly to India because it was too expensive, but we called them and say, "Are you interested in this project? Sorry, we've already started. I'll come and and explain." And they said, yeah, we want to know about this and we want to get involved. So we ended up having extra workshops in Kuala Lumpur to make sure that the Chin ethnic community were involved in the project and the process. And what happened was that it wasn't just the ethnicity. We actually had a woman who was a domestic worker in Kuala Lumpur who was ethnic Chin, who had been running a business in her hometown, and then she was displaced. So we had the benefit of her inputs and her insights. And the Chin ethnic community didn't just provide the geographical and cultural diversity, but they also brought into place different religious viewpoint, and also their lived experience as migrants and refugees in Malaysia, which was quite different from some of the experiences in the Thai-Burmese border and inside Burma. So, that's why when we looked and we say, hey, where are the persons with disabilities? And, do we have women? Are there women who are leading PWD organizations? How can, and they were inside the country. They could travel because they had mobility issues, and so they weren't targeted for forced conscription. But then we also had to recognize the security requirements. So they said they want anonymity, okay. And if they spoke, they would speak under a pseudonym, okay. So we would actually ask them, what do you need? And it also meant that we actually improved and increased our ability to be sensitive and more inclusive. So we would proactively consider, ask the hotels, the meeting venues, and make sure that that it met the needs of a person with disability. So I think those kinds of things, people think of inclusion as being an exercise, and we have to make allowances for people, but actually it's an opportunity for us to learn more and build our ability. And so those kinds of elements we do need to recognize. But I think also all of us here in this room are feminists. All of us have very different aspects of our identity and lived experience. And we wouldn't probably, I hope we won't even, despite all the pain and hassle, we won't have it any other way. And this is a very important part of our identity. And by appreciating that, then we also have to remember and acknowledge that, that having an intersectional, not just an intersectional view, but applying that in the way we work is actually also an expression of ourselves.
Yeah. That is fantastic, Debbie. Thank you. I'm not going to come to you, Nora or Jules. I'm going to wrap up there and say thank you to all of you. We are so grateful for you to come and share your experience, your stories, your passion, and the amazing work that you're doing. We've all learned an enormous amount. So can everyone say thank you in the way that we do online? We so appreciate it. Thank you very, very
Huge
much.
thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to thank Jill. Thank you, Jill. Your great skills always take us through a fantastic session like that. Thank you.
Pleasure.
We know that, we had a good group of people here today, but we know many other people, especially women, who have care responsibilities, will be watching this online, and will watch the recording later. And I just want to give apologies for those who came in at 6:30. We, for some reason, had an invitation for 6 o'clock, and we had our website and LinkedIn saying 6:30. So I encourage you to nip back in once the recording's put up, and you'll be able to just see that first half hour. So again, my apologies. We'll follow that one up and work out how that happened. But once again, thank you all so much. And thanks to everyone who came along too. Very much appreciated, and very much thank you. And we'll be in touch. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Nor. And thank you,
Thank you.
Debbie.
Thank you. Take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Stay
Bye-bye.
strong. Bye.